Okay, this is Chapter 2, Section 2, Part E, Number 6, the Puritan Migration. So in England, there were two different groups that were unsatisfied with the Anglican Church. We've already talked about the Puritans being one of those groups. They wanted to purify the Church of England from within. They wanted to purify all of the Catholic influences in the church. And then there were the separatists, who will later become known as the Pilgrims. They actually left the Church of England because they wanted to get away from the Catholic influences and form their own religion. The separatists were especially being persecuted in England, and they wanted to flee and establish a Christian society in America. So in 1620, along with other colonists, a group of separatists came to America on the Mayflower. And their leader was William Bradford. And this is when they become known as the Pilgrims, because they were making a religious journey or a pilgrimage to America. While still on the Mayflower, they organized a contract called the Mayflower Compact. And it was a set of rules that everyone agreed to follow for the good of all. And it shows us that they wanted peace and organization in their colony. So the Mayflower Compact is actually the first set of written rules or written law in the New World. The Pilgrims settled in Massachusetts. They created the Plymouth colony in Massachusetts. This is where, we get the story of the first Thanksgiving. They celebrated, it was a harvest feast with one of the local tribes. It doesn't actually become a national holiday until 1863 when President Lincoln makes it one. But this is where the story comes from. The first winter was pretty hard on the Pilgrims, but those that survived that winter went on to establish a flourishing colony. There was cooler weather in Plymouth than in the Chesapeake region, so it made disease less of an issue. And they also had a very strong work ethic. They built houses and planted crops and entered the fur trade. And they established a representative government with the separation of church and state. And they were tolerant of other religions in their colony. Well, back in England, there was new leadership in the Church of England, and they really hated the Puritans. They feel like they had gotten rid of the Pilgrims, now let's go after the Puritans. They hated them. And so it led to a Puritan migration to the New World as well, about 10 years after the Pilgrims. Puritans flee to America, again, same reasons as the Pilgrims, to safely practice their religion, and that happened in 1630. John Winthrop was the leader of the Puritans, and his famous quote in a speech he was giving to the Puritans on the journey says, "We must consider that we shall be as a city upon a hill." Basically, he believed that they were chosen by God to create a holy community, to be an example for others, and to inspire change in England, which he believed was morally corrupt. So the Puritans established Massachusetts Bay Colony, which was also in Massachusetts, just north of Plymouth. And they also created a representative government with a governor and an assembly elected by the colony's white freemen, who were also church members. And they also had to own property. So unlike the Pilgrims, the Puritans established a theocracy where Puritanism was the state-supported religion, and other religions were not tolerated. Oh, here's me on vacation in Boston at the grave of John Winthrop. Religion and society in 1630 and 1670. So Puritans embraced John Calvin's idea of predestination, that God decides your fate before you were born. And so they lived in anxiety, not knowing if they were chosen for salvation. The Puritan magistrates, which are judges, wanted to stay in God's favor. So they kept dissenters out of their society. They felt like they had to punish dissenters in order to stay in God's favor. Roger Williams was one of those dissenters. He was a Puritan, but he taught against theocracy. He didn't like the idea that church and state were one. He questioned the Puritans taking Native American land rather than purchasing it. And so because of these things, Williams was actually banished from Massachusetts Bay. And he and his followers went on to establish Rhode Island. They were actually given a charter from the English Parliament that said they could rule themselves. And so when they established Rhode Island, they did not create a theocracy. They had a separation of church and state, and there was no state-supported church. And they would be very tolerant of other religions as well. People could worship as they pleased in Rhode Island. A woman named Anne Hutchinson was also exiled from Massachusetts Bay. She believed that God made revelations to individuals. So she was pretty much diminishing the role of ministers and established authority. And she was declared a heretic. Magistrates also resented her for being a woman taking on leadership roles. Women were considered inferior, but Anne Hutchinson was holding Bible studies in her home, and she was preaching to people. And that went against the patriarchy. And so Hutchinson was also banished from Massachusetts Bay, and she ended up following Roger Williams into Rhode Island. Some other Puritans left Massachusetts Bay on their own accord. They left because of the strict magistrates, and they settled in Connecticut. And Connecticut was very similar to Massachusetts Bay. There was a union of church and state, but voters did not have to be church members. They just had to be white property-owning males, but they didn't have to be church members. This was the site of Anne Hutchinson's house in Boston. It's actually not the house that she lived in. It was just on that site. It was built, rebuilt in the 1800s as the old corner bookstore, but now it's Chipotle. All right, Puritan imagination and witchcraft. So Puritans saw meaning in events around them. Lightning, birth defects, all of those things were a sign from God that God was unhappy with you. They thought these were messages from God. So some Puritans started to perform rituals to fend off evil spirits. And the ministers started attacking these beliefs as superstitious. And authorities started punishing people for witchcraft. The most notable incident of this is in Salem, Massachusetts. A few young girls were having seizure-like episodes, and doctors could not explain those seizures. Well, the girls said that witchcraft was being performed on them by neighbors. And so people were really scared, and it led to this mass hysteria and this mob mentality. Accusations of witchcraft got completely out of control. 175 people were jailed by the end of this incident, and 19 were hanged. So the ties between church and state actually began to weaken in New England because of this. The mass hysteria, the arrests, the executions of the Salem witch hunt disgusted and scared many people. And in the end, when it came out that the girls had possibly made up the fact that they were having these seizure-like episodes, it was just out of boredom, you're not going to see any more legal prosecutions for witchcraft or heresy. Salem was kind of the end-all of that time. Also, after right around the end of the Salem witch trials, the Enlightenment started spreading around in Europe and the Americas. The Enlightenment was a European intellectual movement that traveled to the colonies, and it explained happenings through natural laws instead of supernatural. So it's basically using reason and logic, not God or other supernatural forces, to explain why things are happening. So if the girls were actually having real seizures, doctors would have recognized this as a medical issue and not a witchcraft issue. And so with the spread of the Enlightenment and new ideas and scientific ideas, people started to back off of the witchcraft prosecutions. All right, a yeoman society. So in settling communities in New England, the Puritans purposely made their communities different than it was in England. Remember, they wanted to be an example. They wanted to be different, the city upon a hill. In England, land was controlled by wealthy landowners, and most people were peasants. In the Chesapeake, wealthy planters controlled the land. So in New England, all male heads of families received land. And the land was owned by many people. It wasn't just the wealthy people that owned land in New England. So there's widespread land ownership, which leads to the rise of the yeomen, the small landowners. Now, people didn't always have equal amounts of land, but owning some land was important because it gave you a voice in the government. And so that is what Puritan New England looked like, where you have the theocracy, very strict magistrates, and you can see how it also influenced the development of other colonies. Because they were so strict, people were either banished or they left, and these other colonies flourished in a different way than in New England.